Hey guys, welcome to Rihanna's Lens, where I interact with you about the components in the STEM fields and introduce you to fascinating people who passionately inhabit the scientific and technical frontiers of our society. My name is Rihanna Malhotra, and I'm absolutely elated to share this podcast with all of you. On this episode, I'm joined by a guest who's a third year PhD student at Cornell University. She's also an entrepreneur that has began her own Wildes Doggy Daycare. I'm so glad to welcome and introduce Ari Broad. Thank you so much for coming on. I can't wait to hear your wonderful and unique insights.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So the first thing I wanted to know is that what exactly is it that motivated you to get into biochemistry?
What motivated me to get into biochemistry? Wow, so when I was young, it it's actually kind of a little sad story, but my dad was an alcoholic growing up. And when I was a little kid, I would like hear my parents and older siblings like whispering about that kind of stuff. And like I was curious, like I don't know what they're talking about. So I just looked it up. And then I saw pictures of like brain scans and scarred livers. And I was like, whoa, like this is pretty cool. And then so that kind of sparked my interest in the medical field. And then I went on in high school to do a magnet program where I was able to get my nurse's aid certification. And part of the program was we shadowed a lot of doctors, watched surgeries, did a lot of rotations between different departments. And that's when I realized the medical field was not for me. I just didn't vibe with the constringencies of healthcare. Um, I don't know, like a lot of people don't know this, but healthcare, the care you get from your doctor a lot of times is dictated by insurance and what they will cover, at least in America. Um, and so there would be a lot of cool things that the doctor could do to help the patient, but then they wouldn't be able to. And I was like, I feel like everything is so standardized, they're not really critically thinking. And but then one of my rotations was in a pathology lab where they ran all the samples and stuff like that. And I was like, this is so cool. They can get insight into like the molecular makeup of these cells of the patient just by a couple simple tests. And then I was like, that was the point where I knew I wanted to do research. I just didn't know what research was. So at that point, my goal was to be a pathologist. But then I went to undergrad and I did my undergraduate degree at Florida State University. And I was part of a living learning community called Women in Math, Science, and Engineering. And through them, I was able to get paid part-time for research, which would have never, I would have never done research if it wasn't for this, because I had to work full time through college. So getting paid was crucial for me. And that's the reason why I kind of applied, because I was like, oh, I'd rather be doing something cool than, working a pizza job. And that's when I joined my first biochemistry lab. And that's when I really learned what research was and what biochemistry was. And from that point on, I was set and I never left biochemistry after that.
Right. So I think a lot of what you said just shows that you need to experience things in order to find your right path. So you went through
Mhm.
all of these different experiences just so that you were able to find your dream career and what you really wanted to pursue. So I think that's a great way to tell the high school students or the audience out there that you need to follow your career. You need to achieve your career by following your passions and your dreams to get where you are.
Right. And it's okay uh for your ideas of what you want to change. It's not you don't have to set a goal very young and be like, I will achieve this. My career goals from when I was 18 and I started in a biochemistry lab, they're very different than they were back then. Back then, I wanted to be a professor, and now I want to go to law school after my PhD and work in science, law, and policy amendments. So, it's okay to have a moving target. A lot of young people, they think on their college applications and stuff like that, that they need to be so certain that they're like, I want to go to medical school. I want to go to XYZ after undergrad. This is my long-term goal, yada, 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 right? And they think that shows maturity, as in you're thinking ahead. But what that really shows is immaturity. And any admissions officer can see right through it, because a mature person would acknowledge that, yes, this is my goal right now, but I understand that my goal is a moving target, and I am flexible to follow the path of that moving target.
Right. I mean, at age 18, where your experiences are so limited, like you're only exposed to high school and some extracurriculars outside of that, and you're expected to make a big life decision, that what your career should be and what your life should look like in the future. But you couldn't possibly know that unless you attend, university, and you start experiencing things. Okay, this is how it seems like. This is how work in a lab looks like, and this is how life, if I'm a doctor, would look like. So you won't really know that unless you experience it like firsthand. So at
Exactly.
18, it's too soon for someone to decide what their career will be. I think it just comes through like life experiences and maturity over time. Some people do, yes, they have such a set passion since like right on, and they are so sure about it. Maybe they've experienced it differently before. But I think mostly the scenario that I have noticed, at least, is that people learn over time, because you're not too sure at 18 that you're going to do that for sure, right?
You're not even too sure at 22, early 20s, mid 20s, when you are going to graduate school, if that's what you so choose to do. When you go to graduate school, your first year is composed of rotations, which are 8-week periods in which you try out a lab to see if it's the right fit for you. And every professor knows, and every professor will tell you that whatever you think you're going to go into in research as a first year before your rotations, chances are is the lab you will be joining is a lab you never expected to join.
So then,
it's a learning. I feel like, there's these misconceptions about age, and that as you get older, you get wiser and you can be more certain. And yes, that's true to a certain degree, but my philosophy in life is that you should always be growing. There should be no peak in life. People are like, oh, they peaked in high school or college or whatever. There should be no peak. There should be continuous growth. And part of continuous growth is being flexible on your goals, not being so obstinate and being like, I must do this. And that obstinateness of I must do something is good to a certain degree, because that's perseverance, right?
right.
But at some point, things just like won't work, or maybe they're not for you, and you have to take that as a sign, as to like, maybe I need to pivot. And it's okay to pivot in life and change your goals.
Right. Yeah, I completely agree about that. So now that you finally chose biochemistry later, so how did your educational journey look like?
What did my educational journey look like? So I had a very non-traditional education from a young age. I went to Catholic school for kindergarten and first grade, and then my mom pulled me and my siblings out and homeschooled us until I was in 11th grade. And the homeschool curriculum that I did is not what you're thinking of. It's not like virtual school that you do online. They were books that my mom would order from the company was actually called a Becca Book Curriculum. And part of their philosophy, like their educational ideals, if you look on their website, is we reject the man-made theory of evolution and believe that God created man in his image. And that literally says that verbatim on the website. And so that's a good summary of my primary education. It could be summed up as inaccurate, religion-based. And so I didn't even learn about evolution until I was in college.
Whoa.
So, yeah, that was the first time I learned about evolution, which is because in the curriculum, they just straight up didn't tell you what it was. They were just like, we reject it. It was the smallest section of the biology book. And so I mentioned I did that until 11th grade. So for 12th grade, I went to high school for a year. Because of this magnet program, I was able to convince my mom. She was very against public school because of like the bad influences of other kids and stuff like that, right? But by the time I was 17, 18, like I was pretty strong in my will and morals and stuff like that. So I wasn't really, my mom didn't feel like I was going to get influences much anymore. And so she was like, yeah, go to school, whatever. And so I did that magnet program that I mentioned. It was the first time I've had teachers in my life. So I was very excited to just have people to ask questions to. And that's when I realized that I was a very curious person. I took AP biology, and I always asked my teacher, but why? Like, she'd be like, okay, so then this happens. And I'd be like, okay, but why does that happen? How does that happen? And then she would get so frustrated and just be like, I don't know, Ari, like, I'm just a high school biology teacher. I don't know all the complex mechanisms of how this works. And so that's when I realized I was a really curious and intellectually hungry individual, because that kind of behavior never came out in me before when I was homeschooled. And then I was also part of this program called Upward Bound, which is a program for high school students who are low income or minority. And they helped me get into college by like paying for my college application fees, coaching me on the essay, paying for my SAT, ACT tests, stuff like that. And because I lived in Florida, they have a scholarship program called Bright Futures, and it's funded by the Florida Lottery, ironically. But I got that scholarship, and so I decided to stay in state for my undergraduate degree. And people think, where you go to college is really important, but being past college, I feel like any person who has graduated college will tell you where you go to college doesn't matter at all. It's about what you do in college. It's about the experience that you create. Because let me give you this example. The main three schools I was thinking about going to for undergrad were Florida State, NC State, and Vanderbilt. NC State and Vanderbilt were too expensive for me. And I really wanted to go to Vanderbilt because it's a very high caliber school, right? And especially compared to Florida State. So I felt like, I'd be missing out on a bunch if I didn't go there and I went to Florida State instead. But the reality was financially, I had to go to Florida State. And now looking back, it's very obvious that there are basically two different kinds of students that you'll meet in college. the student who is solely focused on their schoolwork and getting straight A's, and then the student that realizes that life experience is way more important than grades. And so school was the least stressful part of my life in college. And, the classes were just pretty easy for me. I had a couple of hard classes here and there, but I got through them. But mainly, I didn't worry about my grades, and I got A's and B's. If I got a B here and there, I wasn't all in a fuss about it, because I knew that I got a B because I didn't have the time to study as much because I was in lab. And I knew being in lab and getting that life experience was going to be way more important on my grad school applications than the B that I got in microbiology. That's just another thing of, it's a sign of maturity, realizing that grades aren't everything, because it's very immature for someone to be like, I have to get straight A's all the time, because it's a very something that was ingrained in you from a young age. Being in school is that you have to perform well. But the truth is when you get to college, as long as you're maintaining A's and B's, you're all set. Because that's going to keep you above a 3.0. And when you apply to grad school, what they're really looking for is that research experience. Did you do internships, stuff like that? I did 3 internships during my undergraduate time. I did my first one at Louisiana State University's medical school, my second one at Cornell, which was the reason why I decided to go to grad school there, and then my third one at Harvard University. But I think I'll stop talking now and we can go to the next question.
No,
if
I think
answered it appropriately.
No, it was wonderful to hear about your experiences and how different it was. But I think you're absolutely correct about the grades are not the only thing that matter. It is also your experiences, like I mentioned earlier, and what got you there. It's not just about your grades that are building up your resume. Like you can say that it's your experiences. Plus, when you actually get into into the working field, or where you're going to begin working, it is your experiences that will make it easier for you if you're working harder in university to practically do the things that will later help you in your lab work, in your profession that you're delving into. That will be much more helpful than your grades that you have achieved. Because it's their experiences that they'll be asking you about, not the grades once you start working.
Exactly. And another important point is that experiences are tied to superiors or your boss, right? Grades are not necessarily. They're a class you're taking. Yes, there's a professor that's in charge of the class, but if you go to a place like Florida State, you're one of 350 people in the class. Right. If you ask your professor for your organic chemistry class for a letter of recommendation, and there were 300 people in the class, the most that letter of recommendation is going to say is they're a very smart student. They got an A in my class, blah, blah, blah. It's not going to talk about your intellectual curiosities, your critical thinking, your independence, your drive. None of those important things that an employer or a grad school admissions officer wants to see. However, an experience, a research experience or an internship experience, you're going to have a supervisor that is going to guide you through every step of your job, and they're going to really get to know you. And so they're going to be a great letter of recommendation for whatever you decide to do, whether that's a job or grad school. So it's really those experiences that are shaping your undergraduate experience. It's not the school. The school is just, the school is the main reason you're there, right? The classes and stuff like that. But the experiences are so much more valuable in your time. And so a lot of jobs and admissions officers find it really admirable when they find students that like had all right grades, like subpar, whatever. But then they worked really hard in research. They had an honors thesis. They published a paper. That's incredibly impressive for an undergraduate to publish a paper in a doctoral level journal. So if those are your goals and that's what you can strive to, that is going to take you so much further than I graduated summa cum laude.
Right, absolutely. And now, when you were doing your PhD in biochemistry, so what was the coolest thing that you have ever experienced in a lab?
The coolest thing I've ever experienced in the lab. So I would say it's tied for two things. One is the technique of cryo-electron microscopy. So that's basically how we use a really fancy electron microscope that is super cold. It's negative 80 degrees Celsius. Or actually, I think it's even colder than that. I think it's like negative 170 degrees Celsius. Let me be real. But it's extremely cold, and it's an electron microscope, and this is how we visualize proteins. So if you were to ever look up like what's a nice protein, phosphofructose kinase, a protein that's involved in metabolism, right? You could look that up and say structure, and then a picture would come up of this model, and this is how we see proteins. So proteins are not the smallest bit of life, but they are the smallest functional unit. They do some sort of like function, right? DNA doesn't really do a function itself. It needs proteins in order to function, right? So you could think of proteins as like the tiny machines of life, and this is how we visualize them. And I think the cherry on top of that was a different experience I had was using molecular tweezers. And basically what they are is they're not the tweezers you're thinking of for, your hair. They are nano beads that then can interact with microscopic tweezers. And it's just like this machine that you are operating. It's not like I am picking up a strand of DNA. No. DNA is much too small, right? So, but what these molecular tweezers do is they take two ends of a piece of DNA and they stretch it out. And then what happens is you can study proteins that interact with the DNA and say like DNA polymerase, right? DNA polymerase processes along the DNA strand. Well, you can actually measure that velocity of DNA polymerase processing on the DNA strand. So that actually gives us a lot of insight into the biophysics of protein biochemistry, learning about the kinetics of it. So how fast does it move? How fast does it function? These things are very important for recapitulating how proteins work in the body. So the whole thing about biochemistry is we are taking conditions of what happens in the body, and we're replicating that. We're trying to recapitulate it in a test tube. So getting measurements like how fast something moves, that's going to inform us like how long should I let this incubate in this tube to let it do its function, right? How long is too long? Because with biochemistry, those kind of things have to be very precise because you are trying to recapitulate what happens in a cell. And so doing research like that helps us be more precise in our in vitro biochemistry experiments.
Right. I think all of these experiments, they sound so cool, but when you're a scientist or you're just working in a lab, every single experience, or if you're new to it especially, every single experiment or every single thing at the lab would be so interesting and mind-boggling to you, especially if you haven't been in a lab before. Like I'm sure at
Oh,
high school we have seen some experiments here and there, but it must be a very different type of experience when you're a PhD student and doing those experiments at a higher level. Like I know about the polymerase and all of that, but I didn't know that you could actually measure the velocity. So that was really new to me. I was like, whoa, we can do that? Okay, that sounds so cool. So yeah, that's really fantastic that you were able to see that and experiment that.
yeah, it was an amazing experience. And, those are just a couple of the many different kinds of experiments I've done. And, science just mind boggles me all the time. I'm always learning something new. If I didn't learn something new today, whether that was, well, I know not to do this now.
Right.
That's at least something that I always learn.
Right, absolutely. Okay, now getting on the topic about the STEM fields. So, what are some challenges that you faced being a woman in the STEM fields?
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a loaded question. I've definitely faced quite a bit of sexism in the STEM fields. And I would say, the good news is that it's mostly by my peers and not by professors. I've had some incidences with sexist professors, but that incidence is like way lower than people your own age. People your own age have like this very, especially if they have like misogynistic tendencies, they are very egotistical and are like, oh, I'm better than you. Like, you have to listen to me. Like, I'm the one that's in charge. And I'm like, no, we're peers. No one is in charge here. Like, you may be a year older than me, but you are not in charge of me. I can ask you for advice because you are older than me and you have more experience, but that does not make you in charge of me. I would say something that I've struggled with more in the STEM fields than being a woman is being a minority and having a mental health condition. So I have borderline personality disorder, which is characterized by, it's called borderline because it has pathology symptoms of both bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. But the thing is like, that schizophrenia piece is only like schizophrenic monologuing. So like in my head, I have this constant narrative going on, right? But I know it's me. Someone who's schizophrenic would have this constant narrative going on, but they would not know it's them. They would not be grounded in the reality of, it's their own brain, and they would think it's something else or some external stimuli. And that's like where the delusions come in. So like, it's more so kind of like bipolar disorder. So you're still like grounded in reality. But I've had professors that I've confided in this to before, and I've had a professor be like, I don't think grad school is for you because you're schizophrenic. And I was like, first of all, not schizophrenic. Thank you very much. And even if I was, there are many high functioning schizophrenic people who are medicated. It's a big misconception, mental health. They think it's like this obstacle that you can never overcome. But the reality is that these days there's lots of treatments, lots of drugs that help people who do have a mental health disability, and they can function just like anyone else. I've also had a professor basically tell me that I know the system is against people like, and he pointed at me and didn't, say you, but like, dude, you messed up if you pointed at me and you couldn't finish your sentence. Like, you knew that was a wrong sentence. But he was like, I know the system is against people like you, but I want to be the change in that system. So if no one will accept you into their lab, I will. And I was like, dude, I'd rather die than join your lab now. Like, that was either sexist or it was racist. Because what do you mean by people like me?
Right.
Right? Like, who says that? Who thinks of, like, who does not think before they talk sometimes? And that's a lot of times these professors is they just don't think before they talk.
Right.
So smart, but they do not. But yeah, I mean, it's been very challenging not being a man in STEM. Like, I work in one of the best labs in terms of like safe space community at Cornell. Like, my PI on his window in his office, he has a Black Lives Matter, Indigenous Lives Matter, Pride flag hanging up. He's very understanding about my mental health condition and how that affects, my performance in lab. And he has never once said anything sexist, racist, even in the slightest, right? Not even just like, that made me uncomfy. And like, a lot of professors will do that because a lot of them are old. But even still, I'm very outnumbered by the men in my lab. There's 15 people in the lab and there's 4 women. So that is, not a half proportion right there.
Okay.
That's less than a third of us are women, right? So you have to grow a thick skin because you have to, in order to get into the system to change it, you have to be on the inside. And to be on the inside, you have to endure all the sexism, racism, whatever isms, because everyone is, has flaws and anyone who's different will be not ostracized, but at least called out a little bit when they don't want to be. And you have to grow a thick skin because you have to say, like, when all those professors told me I should drop out of grad school because, the system was against me, or because I have schizophrenia, or because research is not for me, I can't execute it. Those are just some of the reasons that I was told. You just have to not listen to them. You can't listen to those voices because they're wrong, because you can prove them wrong. And after I was told all this by all these professors, less than a year later, I won the National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellowship, which is the most prestigious fellowship you can get as a graduate student in STEM. And that made me a free graduate student for my entire PhD because I came in with a fellowship given to me by Cornell already, and that was 3 years. And then I got the NSF, and that's another 3 years. So I have 6 years of funding. That just automatically made me a free student to any professor. And I was like, looks like y'all missed out on having a free student, which professors are sharks for free students. They love them because, that's another person not on their payroll, but is working for them.
Yeah. So I think one thing for sure is that you cannot ask someone to be in your shoes, right? You can't ask someone to think like you. So at the end of the day, you have to push forward, like being a woman in STEM and a woman of color, or just from diverse areas in general, you need to have a strong core from inside because you have to prove them wrong. Like, see, once you won that award and the medal, they were like, okay, they thought back a little. Okay, so was I wrong? So we're trying to change this pattern by proving them wrong. I know, like, you're not supposed to prove yourself all the time, So, but you have to, in a way, being a minority in a field, you have to continuously progress and like prove yourself, at least in the beginning, until people are finally show that, okay, maybe I was wrong. They can do it. So at least
Exactly.
like women right now, they need to continue to prove themselves for the future generation of women that are going to come into this field. Because
Exactly.
we are wading through the waters right now for the future generations to be more confident and so that they are like, sure, yeah, so if they could do it at this time where people are still misogynistic but are slowly accepting, so if they could do it, we sure can, because people will become more accepting in the future. It will take a while. Like, I know it will take a long time, but let's just hope that they will get more accepting and more women will get into this field and prove all of them wrong and say that, see, that you could do this, but so can I, and I can do it better while handling all of these back compliments or just these insults that I've been receiving.
Yeah, that is so true. And the sad reality is Joe Schmo, who's just a white cis man, when he performs badly, it's on him, right? It's Joe Schmo performed badly, not white men performed badly. Joe Schmo did. But when I perform badly, it's not Ari performed badly. It's Native American women performed badly, right? And that doesn't make sense. It doesn't, right? I don't represent all Native American women. I am just one person who happens to be a minority woman. And so my failures are not the failures of my race. I don't represent them in that way. And that's a common misconception, is that or not a misconception, but a misogynistic ideal that a lot of professors have, unfortunately. And I honestly don't foresee like any change in this ideal system until, the older generation starts dying out. And then the newer generation will come in, and they grew up in a different time that is more accepting and sees, and not just sees, but believes in equality.
But
And
even still, like you said, your peers, they still feel like they're more dominating. Even still, I feel like there would still be a bit of misogyny that we would have to wade through because it's your
yeah,
peers. I feel like that hurts more when it's your peers that are telling you that, oh, I don't think you can do this, or I'm better at this than you, essentially. I think that hurts even more than a professor saying it because they're almost the same age as you, right? So you expect them to have that same level of understanding because they have gone through a similar pattern of things. And they know that gender doesn't have anything to do with it. So
mhm.
they should understand that. So I feel like peers it hurts more than professors because okay, they're old, fine. Okay, got it.
Yeah,
But
I think the peers, you know, I think misogyny in STEM will still persist, even after the old people now die off. But I think the prevalence will be much lower, especially with how universities are moving to do their hiring processes. They are looking for diverse candidates that are diverse not only in ethnicity, race, sex, but are diverse in their experiences as well. And recruiting such a diverse workforce creates a more accepting environment. And so because universities are pushing really hard to make this effort to kind of make up for the years of just every professor being a white man, right? And now they're trying to create a more well-rounded department, and each department is trying to do this. And so I think between the university efforts and the progression of society in general, the prevalence will be much lower. But yes, I don't think it's forever going to go away, because unfortunately, the reality is that a lot of scientists that are really good at what they do, and if they are a white cis man, they have an ego that is just like, you don't know how they got this ego. You're like, how did your head grow this big? And this ego that they have, it's kind of self-feeding. So you get this ego because you're good at something. Because you're good at something, you keep on winning. The more you win, the bigger your ego gets. And these are some of the candidates that end up being professors, because being a professor is a very, very hard path to take. It's very selective. There are very few positions for professorships. And unfortunately, those candidates succeed over and over again because they are the ones that are winning the money. They're the ones that are winning the awards and getting the recognition and making the publications. And it's just, it's appalling, honestly. But it takes someone who can do that exact same thing and not be a white cis man, and then they get that position over them because they're like, wow, you don't have to just be smart, you can also be diverse. And like, that's way better because you're going to create a whole different environment for your lab than a white cis man. Like, if I were to be a professor, because I considered doing this, I would be a professor like my boss. He creates a very safe environment and diverse environment. The reality is in biochemistry, the worst I would say ultimately the worst prevalence of, people in STEM that are minority is Native American. I'm the only Native American woman in my program. Actually, yeah, I'm the only Native American woman in my program. I know of a Native American man, which I was very flabbergasted when I met him, because I was like, oh my gosh, you're Native American too? But I think, but everyone forgets about the Native Americans, right? We're the 1% of the population in the US Census, and everyone forgets about us. But if you consider population-wise, Hispanic people and African American people are way more populated than Native American people, right? So it's like, you wouldn't expect a lot of Native American people be in STEM because, not a lot of people go into STEM in general, and the smaller the population is, the smaller the people who go into that field is going to be. But half of our population, over half of it, is African American Hispanic. So why isn't that represented in STEM? In my graduate cohort, there was, the year that I entered grad school, there was one Black man.
Oh, really?
In that program. And I can imagine that's a very isolating feeling for him, and we actually ended up joining the same lab. So I'm very good friends with him now, and we go to each other a lot to talk about these grievances of, what it's like to be singled out. And yeah, that's just something. But in my lab, so I mentioned, he was the only one in the cohort, right?
Yeah.
But in my lab, we have 3 African American scientists, and 3 out of 15 is horrible, right? Still horrible. But if you think about only one is entering every year, or 1 or 2 or whatever, right? 3 seems great. And so you just got to be happy about that. And like, I would have a lab that encourages diversity in race and ethnicity and religion and and experiences, were they poor, were they rich, what was their undergraduate experience like? Did they go to a little, HBCU that did not have much money, or did they go to an Ivy League? Because all of these different perspectives, they create so many different ways you can look at something. And someone who's had different experiences as you is going to look at this piece of data and be like, I just really don't think this, because I had this research experience back at this university and we did this, and this, is similar to this, and I just don't agree with that because of XYZ, and then versus someone else goes, well, I had, this experience and it taught me this, and I think this conclusion from XYZ. So it's all about the different experiences you're getting. And that's what's creating a diverse workforce.
Yeah, exactly. So, I also think if we open our arms to these people and increase representation, because right now it's just 3 people out of, say, 15 that are being welcomed into the area in general. And so, see, people are getting scared to apply in this career, from the beginning, because they're scared, oh, what if I face discrimination? I'm not saying everyone, but there are a huge area of people that are scared to even go forward with it. So I think representation really matters to increase the amount of people that join that area in general. So
100%.
Yeah, so I think if we increase and motivate more people to join a lab, say a lab or just any field, that would increase the amount of ethnicity or race of a person, of a population to enter that field, right?
Right. And that's honestly, in a nutshell, why I do what I do. Why I wanted to come on this podcast, why I do the mentoring that I do, why I do things for my mentees, such as hosting their biology clubs and giving them a journey through science talk. I do this because I realize that I have been given a unique position to not only have worked my way up into a position of, I don't want to say power, because, I'm just a graduate student. My boss has the real power. But in terms of I'm talking to high school students, I have a master's degree, right? So I have much more power than them. But so I got to this position, right? And I realized this is very unique because for, people who are minorities and are women, not many of them make it to this position. And when I was growing up, I had no representation or figures or people in my life that were like, I'm a minority, I'm a woman, I did this, and this is my tips to help you do this. No one did that for me. And so I want to turn around and be like, hey, even though no one did this for me, I do not want this to be the system forever. And so I want to be that person to do it for you. I want to be that representation for other younger students. And that's why I do things like these.
Yeah, and I think that's wonderful. And I want you to keep pushing forward with that and helping more people join these fields, because who knows, in the future, we might be a diverse and welcoming space for STEM students.
Exactly.
So I also want to ask you a bit about your entrepreneurship with the Wildes Doggy Daycare. So what encouraged you to get into that?
So this actually started as an endeavor with my business partner. And he got out, he was in the US military for many years, and when he got out, he kind of didn't know what he wanted to do with his life. And I was given an opportunity to I was actually reached out to by the vice president of the business school at Cornell, asked if I could watch their little Morkie dog for them. And I was like, man, I really can't, because I'm a PhD student. But I know this person can because they're not doing anything. with their life at this point. And so he started watching that dog, and then he got on an app called Rover, and we got more clients, and then we realized, you know, this app is kind of taking a lot of money away from us, so we should just make a business and get all the money, right? And so because, you know, I was kind of involved in it from the beginning, even though he did the work, I did all the back end work. So I did all the marketing, finances, all that good stuff. Everything that you don't think about in a business that requires a business to run, that is what I did. So, and that's what I do. And the coolest thing about my entrepreneurship, so we've had a very successful business. Our business kind of exploded in this area because where Cornell is a very dog friendly area. That's usually the case in more liberal areas that you'll live in. More liberal areas tend to have more educated people. More educated people tend to not have human children. And so instead they have dog children. And we kind of exploited this category of people, right? And we said, you love your dog so much, right? And you want them to have the best life, bring them to daycare, right? And so people ate it up, and you know, now we have over 200 clients, right? And we've only been operational since July 2021. But one sad thing about our business is that we've been dealing with a lot of zoning issues in this endeavor. Basically, we say we are a customary home occupation because part of our stick of our business is that it's not like a daycare center where you go and it's like a big warehouse and stuff like that. There are big chain companies that are like that. Ours is a home daycare. So when dogs come over here, they're laying on couches and beds, and there's a backyard, and it's like their home, right? And so that's why we really exploded, is because of this home model. And the zoning board says you're not a customary home occupation like doctors and dentists and other people who work from home, right? You are a kennel. And we're like, we're not a kennel because we don't abide by the definition of a kennel by law. And so we are actually in a New York State Supreme Court case against the zoning board. And I have done all the legal preparation for it. I've written all the petitions, the memorandums of law, and all of the things a lawyer would do. I became a DIY lawyer for the business to do it. And that really like solidified my interest in law. Because even though property law isn't what I want to do, I really love how law is almost like science. There's a lot of research you have to do, because in science, what people don't realize is like, yes, you're experimenting, right? But before you do that experiment, you have to have a reason to do that experiment. And that reason to do that experiment is you have to look up and do literature research and be like, okay, based off the literature, I think this is what happens. I think this is the hypothesis. Now, I want to do this experiment to test this hypothesis, right? And with law, you're kind of doing that first step of research. So you may not be experimenting anymore, right? But you're still doing that first step of research where you have to find the precedent cases, the statutes, everything that supports your case. You have to do that kind of research. And before I was a PhD candidate and I was preparing for my candidacy exam, that was my most fun time I've had during my PhD program, was writing my candidacy exam. And that's when I found out that like doing science itself doing the experiments itself is not necessarily for me. I like doing them, but I like being able to describe and communicate science much better than being able to do the science itself. I would love to have a job where I just learn and communicate about science all day. And, working in law and policy amendments for science law I think that'll be a good fit for me, because it will combine my two loves of doing the law research and communicating and reading about science. And then, it will affect change as well. And that's what I really want to do, is affect change, because I realize there are so few people in STEM who are minorities because of the systemic oppression in our country. People who are minorities, they typically live in lower income areas, and then their school gets less funding because it's funded off of the property taxes. Their school gets less funding, so they don't have magnet programs. They don't get exposed to that research. They have no idea what research even is. So as someone who wants to be eventually a congresswoman, I want to lobby for, most importantly, funding our education system, because nothing will ever get better until our next generation is adequately educated growing up and can critically think, because that critical thinking is not only going to increase representation in the STEM field, but it's going to help every individual make more scientifically sound decisions, even in things that aren't science, such as choosing your president, right? You can critically think about the data that you're given by the different news sources and make your decision on that person, right? If you have those critical thinking skills. And that's what we need to be teaching our children.
Right. And these are certainly like big goals and plans. And I'm so excited for your future, because I can't wait to see how you will integrate the two together. So I want to know, what is your advice for those students that are wanting to get into this field and delve into a similar path as yours?
So I would say my biggest piece of advice is start your experiences young. I started my first research experience at 18, and many students don't start until their mid-20s. Or their early mid-20s. So that right there already gave me an upper hand compared to my peers just starting at 18. But because you are a high school student, because you are listening to this podcast right now, you have the advantage of getting advice from people, and you have the advantage of getting, ahead in life, because you are already taking that first step in educating yourself. One program I want to recommend to all high school students all over the world is this program called Lumiere Education, which is an individualized research program where you are paired with an Ivy League PhD student and you create your own research project. And this can either be computational or it can be a literature review. And the goal is to get your paper published in a high school journal. And that's not only the research experience itself is going to beef up your resume for college, but also if you get a paper published on top of that, that's really going to beef up your resume for college, right? So it's to help you get an understanding of, is research for me? And then it also, on the other hand, gives you that experience that is going to make you a more competitive applicant for your college applications.
Yeah, that's some really amazing advice. Well, that's it for this week's episode. Thank you so much, Ari, for coming on this week's podcast. I had such a great time getting to know your insights and experiences. So thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. I had a great time talking with you. Thanks for having me.
And to let all of you know, this podcast is now available on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and all your other listening platforms. So please keep listening and stay tuned for more. Thank you so much, Ari. See you.
See ya.